Welcome to a comprehensive review over Latin America for the AP World History exam. They do like to ask Latin America for the essays. There hasn't been a year where Latin America has not been addressed for a good 5 or 6 years. So you definitely want to be sure that you know as much as you can about Latin America. So for the first time period, all they want you to do is to be able to identify the geographical location of the Olmecs and then the Chaven. So the next slide will show you the map. The Olmec are in the Yucatan Peninsula in modern-day Mexico. So this area is going to be kind of the area of cultural development for Mesoamerican cultures throughout Central America. So the Mayans are going to be based out of this region as well. The Chaven are up along the Peruvian coast. The Chaven are going to be unique simply because of the Andes mountain chains. South America is very different in regards to a lot of other areas because of the geographical features that are in South America. You have the Andes Mountains, you have the Amazon Basin, you have the rainforest and all that kind of stuff. So you end up with a huge split for South America that's going to impact its modern politics. So keep that in mind. All of these little territories are going to be unique in their culture because they are not going long distances, they are not trading very far. It's difficult. They don't have horses, they don't have a lot of pack animals, they don't have a lot of easy transportation, and we're in the middle of the jungle or in the mountains, so they're really not going to travel very far. 600 BCE to 600 CE, the AP wants you to be able to identify where Mayan city-states are. You can see that the Mayan culture group was just a series of city-states all throughout the Yucatan Peninsula and in modern-day Guatemala, Honduras, Belize. They are territories that definitely interacted with one another, but there was never any type of Mayan empire. The reason why we group all of these Native American groups into one culture group is because their language was the same. They did have a written language. A lot of it has been lost due to Spanish conquest, but the Mayans were protected under the Spanish Empire, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. So their culture is going to be maintained even today. Teotihuacan is a large city-state that was outside of Mexico City. It was probably a multi-ethnic city-state with a bunch of different tribal people living in the territory, and there's all kind. You can tell that there's different socioeconomic levels because the housing styles were very different. Teotihuacan actually had like apartment buildings that were built for the commoners, and the upper class housing was in a certain region of the city. So there's definitely different social classes as well in the territory. At its height, it probably has about 150,000 people. That's a very large city-state for this time period for the Americas. There was a decline in the population in the 6th century that most historians believe had something to do with ecological issues. So flooding or famine or drought or something caused people to start to leave the city. And then for the longest time, they felt that Teotihuacan had been conquered by someone, like whether that was the predecessors of what will become the Aztecs or whomever. But recently, archaeologists have said that no, the fires that have been found on the ruins of Teotihuacan are only limited to the upper class housing. So now a lot of historians feel that there must have been some kind of socioeconomic rebellion where the lower classes rebelled against the upper classes in the 7th and 8th century. The archaeology that they're doing in this region is still a little bit new. There's still tons to learn, and again, without written languages, it's difficult to decipher exactly what happened in these territories. We do know that Teotihuacan served as a religious center because there's pyramids to various gods and goddesses. They have the orientation is in religious in nature. Most of your Mayan or Mesoamerican city-states are all organized in a certain way. A lot of them are based off of a certain degree off of a mountain, or they're oriented towards the rising of the sun. And so religion was very important, but again, without writing, we're not totally sure exactly what was going on. We do also know that Teotihuacan served as an economic center. Huge amounts of obsidian was going in and out of this territory. The area with the various socioeconomic classes, you know that there was a middle class, you know that there were artisans, you know that there was a complex economic system, and Teotihuacan was a huge trade area. There's no military structures in the city. There's no barracks. There's nothing like that. And the religious leaders were the political leaders. So it was a theology. The priests were really running the show. And that's really all we know about Teotihuacan. But this is this site is super important in regards to understanding the ancient civilizations of the Native Americans, as it's really one of the largest city-states that we found, and it's one of the most significant in regards to trade for this region. The AP exam for the second time period also wants you to be able to identify different types of architectural style. For Mesoamerica, they have this very specific building technique with this inward sloping panel, and that was usually on top of this panel that was perpendicular to the ground, and it's sitting on a slope. All the these are how the pyramids were built, and they're all built in the same style, in the same fashion, including actually down into South America. So they're using the same type of architectural features within the entire Mesoamerican region. The Moche were the Andean culture. This is the culture that's along the Peruvian coast. You can see where they're located on the map, and then the Nazca are further south. The Moche are called Moche, and the thing that they held to, because they hold archaeological findings in these little statues. These little statues are found in these different tribal regions, and if archaeologists find the statues in a little village, then they consider them part of the Moche culture. Again, no written language, so it's difficult to know exactly what was going on. The Nazca are a desert people, and they're known for drawing these lines in the desert. We're not exactly sure how they did this, why they did this. There's all kinds of theories. Why in the world would they carve out a huge monkey in the middle of the desert? And these things are big. And how did they know what it would look like if they couldn't fly and there wasn't any type of way to see these things from the air? So for the longest time, we didn't know that they were there because, obviously we'd have to be able to fly over them to see the lines. But there's hundreds and hundreds of lines in the sand, and nobody really understands why they're there. Going into the third time period with 600 to 1450, you need to understand Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan will become Mexico City, basically. It was founded in 1325, and it becomes the Aztec capital in the 15th century. And of course, it was captured by the Spanish in 1521. It was an economic center that becomes the political center for the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire, we'll talk about again in detail in a couple slides, but the Tenochtitlan was a huge city-state that was built on this island in the middle of a lake, and the island was connected to the mainland through these causeways going north, south, and west. The causeways were large enough for 10 horses to get across. That's a Spanish document that's telling us that, of course, because there were no horses here until the Spanish got here. And they did have bridges that they could actually pull up for at night or for raids or things like that for protection. Their water control in this area was really advanced. They had these levees that were built around the lake to provide fresh water to the city. Montezuma I is the one who actually worked on building that. And then they built 2 aqueducts as well. They basically created like these cisterns out of terracotta to store fresh water for the citizens. And their agriculture was provided through the Chinampa farming system. The city was divided into 4 zones with 20 different districts, and each district had its own marketplace. And the public buildings, like the temples, the ball court, and all that kind of stuff, were in the center of the city, and all the buildings had to be approved by the government. So the city had the same architectural features throughout. So it was a very symmetric look to it, and it was a very organized city. The commoners lived outside the island, and the royal families and the nobles lived on the island, so there's a little bit of a difference there. The commoners would build their houses with reeds and mud, while the rich people used adobe, and so you can see that there are definitely social classes here. Tenochtitlan will obviously be an economic center as well, especially as the Aztec developed their tribute system. This is where all the tribute is going to be delivered. The Imperial Aztec Empire lasts from 1428 to 1521, and it was actually a triple alliance between 3 city-states. So the Aztecs aren't actually a culture group or anything else. It's the name of an empire, and the empire is composed of 3 major city-states: Tenochtitlan, under the Mexica culture, became the military leader of the alliance, and that's where we start calling them the Aztecs. They conquered other city-states throughout Mexico, and when they conquered, they just turned these areas into tribute states. So the city-state rulers remained in place as long as they paid tribute to the capital, and they provided military forces when they were needed, and if the ruler was uncooperative, then the Aztecs would just get rid of them. The city-states were free to continue their own religious practices as long as they added the Aztec god to their pantheon, and the city-states gained protection out of this system as well as economic and political stability. So there's, a good relationship between these tribute states and the Aztecs. At the end, actually, a lot of these city-states were done being under control of the Aztecs. They felt the tribute system was oppressive, and so they actually allied with the Spanish as the Spanish come through and helped the Spanish overthrow the capital, Tenochtitlan. Here are the different tribute states. You can see the different emperors, the different Aztec emperors and what they added. Montezuma II added the southern region to the south, and that will be the last emperor. He is taken out by the Spanish. You can see Tenochtitlan is actually in the northern area of this, and so what we see is the Aztecs going south. You can see that there are Mayan groups out into the Yucatan, and again, as the Spanish kind of landed in the Yucatan and went through this peninsula and up into modern-day central Mexico, what they were doing was gathering these different tribal groups who were fearful of the Aztecs. The Aztecs were a conquering people, and they did use fear tactics because the whole sacrifice thing and the religious features of them to gain loyalty of the different tribal groups. The emperors were seen as representatives of the gods, and they ruled by divine right. Just one emperor you should maybe know is Montezuma II. He made major reforms and really centralized the Aztec Empire. He created a tribute tax that was direct to the citizens rather than the leader. So what he's doing is he's usurping the power of the local leader and establishing more of a central power within his hands. And so he started taxing the citizens directly, and this is where the Spanish are going to be able to gain people to help them to take them out. He does write a new law code. There was actually some laws on the book about executing people for adultery, and the law code increased the separation between classes because there were different punishments for different classes. Schools were created under Montezuma I, and these schools focused on military training or religious training. And there was a secondary school if you were a noble and you wanted to become a priest. They also had trade schools for commoners, so if you wanted to learn some type of trade, like some type of artisan, like textile making or jewelry making or something like that, then you can continue on in your education and become some type of artisan. One thing that Montezuma I did do to appease the commoners is he created this title. The title was given to commoners who did something really good, either for civil service or military service, and there are instances of records of commoners gaining this title and then actually marrying into the royal family. So this was a way for the commoners to gain some social mobility. Flower wars is what the Aztecs would go on in order to gain more warriors for the military. The Aztec Empire and the Aztec military didn't go and just kill people. That was seen as weak militarily. What they wanted to do was capture people. And then those captives would oftentimes be used in the ritual sacrifices. A lot of times they would go on these flower wars in order to gain captives whenever there was some type of ecological issue, and they felt that they needed to appease the gods. And so they would go on these flower wars to gain captives to sacrifice for the gods. Cortez arrived in Tenochtitlan in November of 1521. He only had 630 Spanish with him, but the local tribes who didn't want to be tribute states anymore were supporting the Spanish. Cortez actually spent 6 weeks as a guest of Montezuma in Tenochtitlan. Montezuma was eventually killed by in a skirmish in the city. Montezuma II. The killing of Montezuma II could have been by an Aztec. It may not necessarily have been the Spanish. However, the Spanish knew that they were going to be blamed for the murder of Montezuma II, so they tried to run away. The night that they tried to run away is called La Noche Triste, the long night, and some of the Spanish actually died because they had gold in their pockets, and when they entered into the water to try to get off the island, they drowned. Just let that sink in. After their escape, smallpox, the Spanish do manage to get off the island. Smallpox entered the city and kind of ravaged it, and so it was easy for Cortez to come back and kind of defeat the next emperor who took over after Montezuma died. The Inca Empire lasts from 1438 to 1533, and they used both conquest and assimilation to expand. They did a lot of negotiating and a lot of diplomacy rather than conquering. So the Inca is actually just the title. It means king or son of the sun. And it developed out of this, the village of Cusco, and the Cusco Inca just starts to kind of spread. The territories were separated into 4 provinces, and what the Inca did was they would go out, they would send spies out, they would find areas that they thought would be good for their empire. They would try to negotiate with that ruler, and if the ruler said, okay, sure, you will be my overlord, here's my kids, go train them. And so it was kind of like the kids were going into Cusco not only for training, but also kind of as insurance of loyalty out of these other chiefs. If the leader didn't agree, then they would be conquered and killed. The Inca Empire didn't keep written records, but they did actually use quipu, which is a series of knots that kept census data and other economic data, but nobody's sure how to read them, so the estimations on the number of people that were part of the Inca Empire is all over the place, as small as 8 million up to 37 million, simply because the quipu, we don't know how to read them. There were social distinctions, and the social distinction was actually shown by deformity of the head. The upper class citizens would wrap the infant's head and cause the skull to grow in an elongated fashion, and so if you had this elongated skull, then you were upper class. I'm not sure what that did to, obviously there's no clue what that did to brain development. We have no idea. But I'm sure it probably wasn't good. There was a moral code to the Inca. It was do not steal, do not lie, and do not be lazy. And that can be seen in the Mita labor system. They used a vertical archipelago economic system. Basically, the laborers were organized into ayllus, or communities, according to lineage. So there were a bunch of different languages spoken throughout this Incan territory, and so they were probably organized by their language groups. Due to ecological diversity, there was actually a lot of migration between the ayllus, so the ayllus would actually move around. Only 2% of Andean lands are arable, and so it's difficult to gain enough food for everybody. Under the Inca, the ayllus were organized into the Mita, and the Mita is just like a corvée system where it's just a labor tax. And the labor tax would support the needs of the central city, and that would provide the emperor and the royal family all the food and everything that they needed. The system is somewhat socialist communist in its nature because it's the idea of reciprocity, or ani, which is basically the idea is that all the goods were valuable and they were all somewhat of equal value because everybody needed them. And so the idea was that the different ayllus would share and barter, and it was kind of the good of the community idea. The quipu kept all this language, or all of this data, but again, we can't read it. The Spanish arrived in the middle of a civil war. There was a couple of tribes were actually trying to succeed from the Incan Empire, very similar to our Civil War, actually. Pizarro met with one of the Inca in Cusco and told him that he had to pledge his allegiance to the Spanish king and convert to Christianity. The Inca was obviously confused, and what Pizarro thought was delay because they were planning on revolt could have just been an issue with translation. So he arrested the last Inca and put him in this room, and the Inca promised to fill the room with gold and silver, which he actually fulfilled. He fulfilled this promise, but Pizarro took the gold and killed the Inca anyway. Rival Incas from the Civil War were also killed by the Spanish. Tupac Amaru was the last Inca holdout, and he was the last one killed. But ultimately, the Spanish are going to take over this territory as well. The Spanish crown set up a viceroy system to rule these territories. You can see on the map the different viceroys. The viceroyalty of New Spain is obviously Mexico, and then America will fight with Mexico and get a bunch of that territory. You have New Granada, Rio de la Plata, and then Peru. Remember that Brazil is Portuguese, so I'll talk about Brazil in a separate slide. So the viceroy was handpicked by the king, and the king granted encomienda to the conquistadors as a reward for their service. And as a result, the natives got protection, the natives got an education, and the natives' basic needs were met. In return, the Spaniards got tribute, like metals, food, and all that kind of stuff. And it continued. And then in Peru, they kept the mita system going instead of using the encomienda system. As the natives started to die, this encomienda system got more and more complex, and so eventually they had to create what was called the repartimiento system. This system was a tribute labor system. It was a lot more like the mita system that was already used in the Viceroy of Peru. So what they're doing is they're going to use this system in New Spain and all the other territories as well. This was under a new law code called the New Laws of 1542, and this is where we get our haciendas. And basically what the king would do is he would grant, at this point, not the conquistadors anymore, but they would grant these plantation lands to these people, and so the different Creoles or Peninsulares would become landowners, and they were responsible for getting the labor for their own land. So they would use natives, or they would start importing slaves to replace that loss of native life. In order to control these individual pockets of natives, the Spanish created the República de Indios, where the natives were free to rule themselves, as long as there was a parish priest and they paid their taxes. So a lot of the Mayan culture and a bunch of the other Native American culture groups were going to survive as a result of being separated out. And so they started to, this is also going to lead to the increased use of slave importation, because the natives were not necessarily being used as laborers anymore. There was a huge mixing of races in Latin America. You have the mestizos, which is your European and natives. They're not subject to encomienda or repartimiento laws at all, so they were free. And then the mulattoes is when the Europeans and black would mix. And a lot of times these mulattoes were granted freedom by their fathers. So this will create conflict through the independence movements because there's so many different social classes. The British and the French in the New World, they did set up colonies in most of the islands of the Caribbean, and they used the plantation economy. They imported slaves for their labor force, and we do have mixed races develop on those islands as well. So social strain between the Peninsulares, which are people who were born in Spain or Portugal, the Creoles, people who were born here but were of European descent, and then of course your slaves. Then you have free people of color with the mulattoes and the mestizos, and then of course all the mixed races. This is going to create the goals of each one of these social groups creates the independence movements. But unfortunately, these goals were all different, which causes a lack of unity, which makes the independence movements really complex and very, very difficult. The invasion of Spain and Portugal by Napoleon gave the Latin American colonists an opportunity to revolt. So because the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs were taken off the throne by Napoleon, the Latin American world decides, hey, now's the time. The Haitian Revolution began when the French revolted against their king in 1789. You guys know enough of that we don't really need to review that. If you do need a little bit more review on that, you do have the link to the Haitian Revolution video, or you could just study those video notes as well to get a quick review of the Haitian Revolution. Puerto Rico and Cuba will remain under the control of the Spanish until the Spanish-American War in 1848. For Brazil, it's a little different because the royal family fled Portugal when Napoleon showed up. They got on the boat, they crossed the ocean, and they end up living in Brazil for the length of Napoleon's rule. When they returned, Prince Pedro was left in Brazil, and he was pushed by the Creoles to sign a constitution and declare independence. So Brazil becomes independent very easy. It was an easy transition, and Brazil is put under a constitutional monarchy very early on. For Mexican independence, it's very complex. So the Bourbon king tried to place limits on the Creole elites in Mexico, and they didn't like it. So when the Spanish king was removed from his throne by Napoleon, the viceroy declared himself sovereign over New Spain in 1808. So from 1810 to 1820, it's all kinds of chaos. Nobody knows who is in charge. There's peasant revolts under Hidalgo and then Morales. And then the Spanish throne, when the king was put back on the throne of Spain, he tried to recapture Mexico, and this fails. So from 1815 to 1820, there's this constant warfare between the Mexican natives, the now Mexican natives, and the Spanish troops. The Mexican Empire with a Catholic monarch was declared officially in 1821, and then they switched that government system to a republic in 1823. Isabella II, the Spanish queen, eventually recognizes an independent Mexico in 1836. So Mexico officially becomes independent in 1836. Southern Mexico declared its independence from Mexico, and this is where we get Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, and all that happened 2 years after Mexico was recognized as independent by the Spanish queen. As far as South America goes, Jose San Martin and Bolivar organized rebellions against the Spanish military, and they're going to use the lower classes, and they promised freedom for fighting. And this is going to cause some issues after they finally gain their freedom. Bolivar wanted to create this Grand Colombia. He wanted to create like a centralized system for all of South America, but it's not going to happen. The geography of South America is too diverse, and there's too many different language groups and too many different native groups that were being incorporated. The economies of the different territories were very different, so there's just no way to create a Grand Colombia, and Bolivar ultimately loses out. Economic effects of the independence are basically causes some serious issues for Latin America. The independent movements took so long, and there's a lack of political stability for so long that the economy is completely destroyed. Spain had controlled all of the industries in this territory, and since it ended, there was no central control of the economy, and so the new states were unable to reestablish any type of industries that were already in place, like textile mining. There's a lack of industrialization and modernization because of the fighting during the independence movements, and so the production of Latin American products was less efficient, and the products were more expensive to make, so they weren't really exporting them because nobody was buying them. So a lot of the different states try to get foreigners to come in and invest in the infrastructure of Latin America, help them build railways, help them build factories, help them build, industrialize basically. But U.S. and Britain was so busy with their own wars between the War of 1812 and independence movements for India and all that stuff for the British, they weren't able to really invest on a large scale in Latin America. So ultimately, Latin America ends up exporting raw materials and importing finished products. Socially, the lower classes were trying to be included in the new political systems, and that was causing some serious problems. The conservatives wanted to maintain the same social system that was already in place because they benefited from it. They were rich from it. They were the plantation owners. They were the landowners. They wanted laborers. They wanted the lower class to stay lower class. But obviously the lower class, because they learned about enlightened ideas through the independence movements, and they were told that they were going to be gaining things from the independent movements, which is why they fought, they're going to become pretty aggressive about getting their needs into these new constitutions that were being written. Native communities really didn't like some of the changes that the liberals were doing because that equalized them with the lower classes, and the natives were protected under that Repúblicas de Indios system, and so they don't necessarily like either side, the conservative or the liberals, and so there's a whole conflict there as well. Slavery was ultimately abolished, but in all of the Latin American states by 1850. So it took a long time for each state did it differently, but it wasn't the guaranteed freedom that was promised to the Black Latin Americans through the wars of independence. Political effects of independence were that there's this struggle between the conservative and liberals. There's struggles between trying to create a central system or a federalist system for all of Latin America. That ultimately fails. There's also difficulty in creating new state identities, making the Mexicans Mexican, making the Peruvians Peruvian, and making them loyal to these new governments that were put in place. There's also border disputes amongst the new states because they were all fighting together to get rid of the Spanish. These new states were fighting over where their borders should actually lie. This will lead to the creation of what's called the caudillos. The caudillos is basically a military type leader. Because there's so much chaos, the Latin Americans ended up kind of following one military guy who ended up being kind of a stronghold for these different territories. You also have to deal with America during the 1800s in regards to Latin America. In 1823, the United States issues the Monroe Doctrine that told Europe to stay out of our affairs. So basically, we claimed ourselves to be the de facto rulers of the Western Hemisphere, and that meant that we were going to be involved in the politics of Latin America. Then we had the Mexican-American War in 1848. Obviously, America won, and we purchased a huge amount of land from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and this will kind of set the borders between Mexico and America that are already in place. We got the better end of that deal because we gained the Colorado River, and we happened to gain a lot of territory that had this stuff called gold in it, and so we ended up with the gold rush in 1849 that came from us purchasing all this territory from Mexico in 1848. We go to war with Spain in 1898, and as a result of that, we gained control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and then, of course, the Philippines as well. And so we end up letting these territories be kind of independent, but not really. And that's still kind of the case today for places like Guam and Puerto Rico. The Panama Canal opened in 1903, and we were definitely involved in that. Panama was actually part of Honduras, and we encouraged the Panamanians to revolt against the Honduran government to create an independent state because Honduras was being resistant to our involvement in building the Panama Canal. Panama, since we helped them become independent, was more than willing to allow the Americans to help them build the Panama Canal. We still have a lot of economic interest in the Panama Canal, and it's super important to our military for us to be able to get from one side of the country to the other. And then, of course, the economic impact of using the Panama Canal to get our stuff from ship from one coast to the other as well is super important. In the modern day, one of the major changes in Latin America was associated with the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution took a good 10 years to actually be put in place. It started over the rule of Diaz. President Diaz had been president for 35 years. From 1876 to 1911. He was a strict capitalist, which means that he actually brought prosperity to the hacienda owners, and the poor became poorer. So he was a very right-side capitalist, and most of the improvements in Mexico were actually being paid for by the British and the U.S., so the Mexicans themselves weren't even investing in their own country. Francisco Madero ran for president in 1910, and he said that Diaz had done some illegal stuff through the election, and so he created a movement called the Plan of San Luis Potosí. And what this movement was to try to make Diaz's presidency illegitimate, make Madero the provisional president, create and extend democracy throughout Mexico, because there were a lot of people that were not able to vote. You had to own land to vote in Mexico, and of course women were not recognized as voters at all. And he wanted to return lands to the villages and break up that hacienda system so that they could equalize land ownership a little bit better. Diaz ends up running away, and he's exiled to France in 1911. Madero was assassinated in 1913 by people who liked the Diaz system. So obviously kind of the richer upper-class hacienda owners did not like what Madero was doing. In the countryside, you have Pancho Villa and Emilio Zapata, who are creating these peasant revolts. They were organizing the lower classes in order to kind of revolt against any type of system that was being put in place. So there's like this 10-year war between all the different social groups and all the different economic levels, and nobody really was in charge for a good 10 years. Finally, in 1917, they write the Constitution. As a result of the Mexican Revolution, 1.5 million Mexicans died, and 2,000 had fled and immigrated to the United States. The Constitution in 1917 set up a presidential system with a bicameral legislature, so they have a two-house legislative assembly just like we do. The presidents serve one term for 6 years. They broke up the large landed estates, the haciendas were no more, and they redistribute the land amongst the poorer people. They also did create a Bill of Rights in this Constitution, so very similar to kind of what we had that protected basic human rights. They established a free public education that was separate from the Catholic Church, and this is really the first time that the Catholic Church definitely loses power in Mexico. And they establish workers' rights, things like 8-hour workday, clean work environments, minimum wages, things of that nature. So this constitution has actually been used as a sample constitution to other newly written constitutions throughout the world. And the Mexican government is actually pretty stable. Unfortunately, their economy is what the problem is for them today. American involvement in Latin America is still rampant. We did a lot of containment of socialism and communism. If you guys want a review of that, you can go to the Cold War lecture and look at the proxy wars in Latin America. We have the issues with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, where we were trying to make sure that they weren't in charge. We kind of caused a civil war in Guatemala over this land controlled by the United Fruit Company. One of our biggest things with Latin America in the most modern age is NAFTA. NAFTA is a North American Free Trade Agreement where we allow free trade between Mexico and the United States and Canada. This has had a huge impact on Mexican economy, and Mexico is actually developing a huge middle class as a result of NAFTA. You have the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Castro overthrows Batista. Castro becomes communist because the United States was not willing to support Castro. We don't like Castro, and we tried twice to take him out. We do it once with the Bay of Pigs invasion under Kennedy, that failed, and then during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we managed to separate the connection between the Soviet Union and Cuba in 1962. Another example of modern Latin America would be in Argentina under Juan Perón and his wife. A lot of the caudillo system that was developed out of the chaos from the post-independence era kind of remains in place for Latin America, and as a result of that, a lot of the Latin Americans depend on strong military dictator-type, authoritarian-type figures. For Argentina, the Peróns ended up being kind of benevolent. They were nice. They did a lot for women. They did a lot for the underclass. They created a lot of social welfare programs for the Argentinians, the lower class Argentinians, to try to equalize those social groups out a little bit.